So next up on the stand here, we have Will Freeman.
Oh, yeah. You just totally forget you're wearing.
For those of you who don't know, Develop Magazine is the monthly magazine for game developers. If you don't read it, you can read it. It's a publication in our industry. It's published by Intent Media, who also publish MCV, which is Trade Weekly, which you should also read. I mean, there aren't that many game development publications, and if you're going to follow a career in the games industry, for God's sake, read the publications that are vitally important to communicate what is going on. Will.
Thank you. I'll go with the same as these two guys, if everyone can hear me okay. So my talk is called So You Play Games for a Living, and a rough guide to games journalism for curious developers. I understand most of you have already decided you're interested in being game developers, and here I am to talk to you about being a games journalist. But it can certainly be an alternative career path in the industry, or a complementary one to what you're doing, or even one that can kickstart a game development career or kind of inform your game development career. So hopefully it'll be of some use to some of you. The title comes from a question you'll have to get used to being asked if you were to ever be involved in games journalism in any way. It is the assumption that I wish I sit playing games for a living all day. So I'm Will Freeman, editor of Develop Magazine. I also do reviews for The Observer in print and The Guardian online, and I hate this egotistical bit where you talk about what you've done, but also used to be a PR working on Sega titles, so hopefully that gives you some context for what I'm talking about. So journalism can certainly be a great career, and the first point is probably the one that's most relevant to people that are wondering where in game development or the games industry they would like to go, because games journalism, one day, I've already been at a tool company earlier today, then I might be writing a piece on audio, then I'll be visiting a studio. I spend a lot of time talking to PRs and the people doing marketing. So you really do get an experience of, or not even a cross-section of the industry, just the whole industry, and it's fantastic in informing your perspective of the industry in that regard. It's a really press-friendly industry. I have fellow journalists who maybe work in fashion or cinema or something that cover those kind of topics as a journalist, and you're generally hated. The games industry is an enthusiast industry, and that applies to the games journalists as well. So it's a very nice industry to be a journalist in. Few people certainly hate us, of course. There's a hell of a lot of travel being a games journalist. I had barely left the country until I started working full-time as a games journalist. Now I probably go to another country once a month, once every couple of months. So if you like seeing the world, and it's all right, then journalism is a great way to get to have that opportunity. Meet your heroes, pretty obvious one. I grew up obsessed with games and wanting to be a games journalist, and now many of the people who were once these kind of idols of mine are people I have interviewed or worked with, or have even become part of my social circle. And if you are interested in kind of the credit for your work, I've put your name in tiny lights. It doesn't particularly, it's not part of the appeal for me, but you will get credit for your work and you'll get to see your name out there, which is certainly rewarding for people. But it isn't all fun. You won't get rich being a games journalist. So I'm not trying to claim it's awfully paid, and I'm very happy with my lot, and I can certainly get by. But if you're interested in making money, and real proper money, maybe don't go for games journalism. There's some very long hours, but you guys all work in the games industry, are looking to work in the games industry. Across the industry, there's long hours. So if you're put off by long hours, then maybe games isn't for you, regardless of whether it's as press or a developer. I was just saying how great the travel is. There's a hell of a lot of time away from home. A couple of months ago, I think I was in the country 3 days, and when that's every month, it can kind of get, it can kind of get exhausting. So if you're not really up for hitting it and really up for travelling all the time, then maybe you should, it's the opposite of spending a lot of time at home. Your career can peak early. I'm 31, I'm an editor. I'm already having to think about what I would do next beyond an editor, and it can be difficult, but again, I think that's why games journalism as an experience could be useful for developers, because the opportunities, as I'll touch on later, of that journalism brings are manifold. Your career can peak early, but it opens lots of doors. And you need a thick skin, as I'm sure you do as a developer, and the days of online, as we are now in the days of online commenting and so on, basically, I mean, you could go to The Guardian and type in my name and find my reviews, and there'd be some, just enjoy reading the comments about what an awful human being I am. So, types of games journalism. Now, I hope this will help those of you with an interest in doing games journalism, but if you're not remotely interested, it's still worth knowing the main types of journalism for when you are approaching the press wanting them to cover your game, because if you can be targeted towards different types of journalism, then you're making a busy journalist's job easier and increasing your chance of coverage. Consumer journalism is national newspapers, Heat magazine, FHM, stuff that is generally for everyone and about broad topics. And it certainly, as a journalist, gets you wider exposure, and that probably brings you more opportunities, perhaps outside of the games industry, but it definitely puts you out there. Specialist would be Edge, Games TM, Official Xbox Magazine, Eurogamer, that kind of thing. And if you're really interested in playing games and reviewing and really being there with kind of AAA and mainstream games, Specialist Press is probably the one for you. Trade or B2B, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say what B2B stands for out loud, but it is business to business. It's part titles like Develop, like MCV, GamesIndustry.biz, Gamma Sutra, Game Developer, and there's a lot more variety in the type of writing you get to do, and you really feel part of the industry community. I love it when visiting GDC, you feel very much part of the industry you're writing about, rather than perhaps the consumer and specialist press who are observing the games industry rather than being part of it. Certainly I've had experience of all four on this list, and the trade and B2B stuff is the stuff I love the most. Freelance, that's the kind of thing you could do as a game developer on the side. You can be an expert freelancer. We'll come to that later, but in short, freelance, there's a possibility of some earning some really decent money out of it if you can get to that tipping point, and there's certainly a huge variety of writing. What you need to like. I mean, I've put the word writing. I'd hope that would be obvious, and I feel like a bit of an idiot putting it there, but at the same time, I've definitely come across quite a lot of games journalists who like games and aren't necessarily really into writing. If you're going to be a full-time games journalist, you've got to be the kind of person who gets annoyed when a shop sign has the apostrophe in the wrong place, or really delight in your own anger at when people muddle up semicolons and colons. You've got to love writing, and you've got to be a bit of a nerd for it. And you've got to love video games of every kind. If you're furiously devoted to one platform or to one genre, that might limit your opportunities as a games developer. You've got to be open-minded to everything, unless perhaps you're a games developer doing a bit of freelance on the side and then maybe having a specialty as a strength. Hard work, again, we're all in the games industry or about to be in the games industry, so hard work is no way exclusive to games journalism, but it's certainly part of games journalism. I've said it a couple of times, but the travel, the socialising, the networking, not only kind of in the daytime, but in the evening, there's always press events, there's always a constant networking thing going on. You really have got to, I was about to say, be able to bear people, which probably is reflective of my perspective, but you've really got to be able to enjoy being out there amongst people. And again, as with the rest of the games industry, irregular hours, weekends, travelling, all that kind of thing. But, I adore regular hours. I couldn't buy the idea of the same hours every day. So, how do you become a games journalist or a developer who does a bit of journalism on the side? It's probably harder than ever now. The blog exists. It didn't even 7 or 8 years ago when I started full-time. Blogs weren't the thing they are now. So the line that divides professional journalist with blogger is becoming more and more of a blurred line. Everyone can can express their opinions through words online. So standing out from that is tough. But I would suggest starting a blog if you want to become a games journalist, because it gives you an opportunity to tighten up your writing style, gain experience, learn your writing voice, which is the most important thing you can do as a games journalist. But I also sadly would advise you have to work for free for a while. Write for anyone you can, write for various publications, it doesn't matter what it is, but get some stuff published. But be prepared to draw a line, because believe me, you could go on forever writing for free, and Fortunately, games journalism or journalism in general is not as bad as some industries in how long you have to work unpaid, but be prepared to do a bit and get some work experience under your belt. I mean, it's an obvious one, but our magazine has perhaps employed, or Develop and MCV together have employed 3 people who've previously been work experience people. It gets you experience, it gets you a taste of seeing if you like it, and it gets you contacts. So you just really need to get, I mean, my first work experience was for the Brighton Argus, a regional paper, writing a games piece, and, you know, it's part of the reason I'm here now. Journalism qualifications are certainly optional. I'd say it's about a 50-50 split between myself and my colleagues in terms of whether we've had journalism qualifications or not, but it doesn't matter. Don't be put off by not having a journalism qualification or much experience, because again, if you were going to be this developer who makes a bit of cash on the side writing an article about games audio, then it's your experience of the topic that's important, not your experience as a journalist. And being a PR, so the people, a lot of game companies will have a PR who will help me. They'll be my point of contact when I'm writing about a game and need to get some information about a game or game company. Typically, journalists become PRs because PRs are a lot better paid, but idiots might, like me, start off in PR because it's relatively easy to get a job in PR based just on your enthusiasm of games. When I went to my first interview as a PR, I didn't know what PR stood for, and I got the job. So, you know, and then my job was phoning journalists all day, and when I decided I despised PR, I left with a list of journalists that I'd been contacting all day, and thus perfect foundation for a freelance career. Considering freelance can be far better paid, but to get to that tipping point where you start to earn a lot of money is tough. There's only a few games freelancers who are big names, and those guys, I don't want to, you know, again, it's not going to make you rich, but it can make you more than being what I am, which is mostly a staff writer, someone going to the desk every day. Well, won't get there occasionally. But yeah, so it can be harder to establish yourself, but you do get a freedom, a kind of personal freedom and a variety of writing. The downside's like any freelance, no holiday days, no sick pay, but as I've mentioned a few times, you can juggle it with being a developer. We have a couple of developers who are regular contributors to our magazine, and their day job is being a game developer, but they contribute to our magazine and several others as experts on a topic, and it's a nice way of them making a bit of extra cash. They're constantly making contacts, they're constantly putting their company in the spotlight. I mean, Will Luton of Mobile Pie Games now does a column for Develop, so he gets a page of editorial for Develop every single issue, and the exposure for his company is fantastic. So maybe being a developer who does a bit of freelance can be good for your studio. You'll have to spend a lot of time on your own being a freelancer. Sadly, it does happen. The stereotypes about sitting indoors, barely having got dressed, writing all day, realising you haven't turned the lights on when it's 6 p.m. and you need to turn the lights on it. Some people don't enjoy how much time you spend on your own as a freelancer. Time is ticking, so I'm going to race through this, but to do well at freelance, recycling your articles is a really important point. If I do an interview with a developer as a freelancer, maybe I could pitch it to a trade publication like Develop, maybe I could angle it a different way for the Observer, and maybe I could write it a different way for a kids magazine. If you're a freelancer, sending your articles to everyone you can is all important. Never turning your nose up is also important. I know a freelancer who used to, I don't know if he still does, make £200 a month from the Dog of the Week page in a magazine about dogs, which was where readers were meant to send in pictures of dogs, their dogs, and get a £200 prize. He saw that as a freelance opportunity and contacted them and said, if I send you a photo of a dog every month, can I have £200 regularly? It'll be easier for you. They said yes. I'd love to be paid £200. He did write a few lines of dialogue with it in the voice of the owner of the dog, but I mean, I'm not suggesting that taking pictures of dogs will help your career as a developer, but not turning your nose up at the places you write is a good way to establish yourself as a freelancer. Never lay all your cards on the table. If you're an editor of a magazine and I'm pitching my idea to you, I need to say, I've got this interview done, I've got these facts, I've got these contacts, I've got these images. I don't want to give you them, because then, if you're an unscrupulous type, you can say, thanks very much, no, I won't pay you for that, I'll use it all. So be careful when approaching people as a freelancer. Just say what you've got, don't give them what you've got. Specialise is important, especially if you were going to be a game developer doing this bit of freelance on the side I keep waffling on about. We have a guy that always does our audio stuff who happens to be a game sound guy. Specialising has been his strength, and he's written all over the place about game audio, even for film magazines who are doing a piece on maybe what can be learnt from the games industry, that kind of thing. But then, at the same time, I've always been told never specialise, because the second you specialise, you're cutting off other potential revenues. So, it depends. If you're going to be a full-time freelancer, I'd say don't specialise too much. I've written about nothing but games for 8 years. I imagine I'll probably be writing about nothing apart from games for a while. But if you were going to do it as an aside, as a complement to your job as a developer, then maybe specialising is great, because I'm editor of Develop magazine. If you come to me and say, I do this for my day job and I want to write about it, I'm going to listen a great deal more than if you each week contact me with something totally different. The future for journalists. As I said, your career can peak early as a journalist, but the doors it opens are fantastic. Consultancy work, so working with a game developer, I've done that a few times and it's really exciting. It's a really nice way to be a kind of freelance expert involved in a game. It's fantastic. You can do broadcast. I'm not exactly supremely confident at it, but TV and radio can become a way of earning money and establishing yourself in a different way. I mean, Charlie Brooker, he wrote for Dreamcast magazine for a while, and that's where it all started for him. Talking at conferences, hopefully me standing here is evidence that being a journalist can afford you the opportunity to talk to people sat in rooms listening to you, and when you climb the ladder and start to do it at GDC, the doors it can open for you are fantastic. Moving into games development, when I started at Develop magazine, our then deputy editor was there for maybe 6 months to a year while I was there, and then moved on and became an assistant producer, and is now a producer, I believe, at Mediatonic. So he used games journalism to get himself a career as a games developer. Or, as I mentioned before, if you're interested in the old money, then journalism can afford you a move into PR. Now then, I'm assuming a lot of you aren't remotely interested in being games journalists, because you're already trying to be game developers and you've been listening to me talk about how you should become a games journalist. But I'm now going to attempt in 1 or 2 slides and about 30 seconds to digest a talk I did a few months ago about how startup studios, indies, micro studios, small studios can get coverage in the papers and the press and the magazines and online when you're potentially competing with EA's multi-million pound marketing budget. So let's see how well this works in a minute. My main thing here is about being part of the community of the games industry. The games journalists and game developers are talking together all the time, and although before I had any sense about me, I used to despise Twitter and think it was for idiots, it's been a fantastic part of my career now. I've more than embraced it. And there is a constant conversation on Twitter between games press, PRs, journalists, games press and journalists, games developers, tools companies, and becoming a natural part of that conversation is how you stand out when it's time for you to ask a journalist for coverage. Because I get, and I wish this was an exaggeration, but I get between 20 and 200 press releases a day. I mean, the 200 mark would be during GDC and E3 and stuff. And I probably get offered several features a day and several interviews a day, and I've got to fit them into one magazine. So obviously I can't afford to listen to everybody. But when it is someone that I recognise as someone who's always there on Twitter, at events, much like this one, so you're already doing partly the right thing, and any other free events you can get to, then being part of that community and being one of the faces that's always there, even if you've never released a game or a high-profile game, being one of those faces means when I see your press release pop up in my inbox with the hundreds of others, I'm going to be more attracted to it, I'm going to be more keen to write about it. And I'm talking about Twitter. You don't have to be always on there being corporate and being professional. I'm going on to my second point here. Just be yourself, be excited about what excites you, be enthusiastic. I mean, I spend most of my time on Twitter talking about collecting dancehall records, arcade PCBs, and probably skate shoes, to be honest. Quite dull topics and nothing to do with the games industry, really. But some of the people, I mentioned that Will Luton from Mobile Pie, who's been fantastic at spreading his profile. It was a conversation about arcade machine parts that got us two talking, and now he's got a regular column in Develop. His profile has increased. He writes all over the place. He's writing a book. So don't be big or corporate or try and be glossy like EO. Just be yourself, have some personality, get your face at events in front of journalists like me, and get yourselves on Twitter and just talk to me, talk to everyone, be part of that conversation, and be targeted, make a journalist's job easy. That goes back to those four main types of journalists there are, and perhaps tailoring your contact with each one differently, considering what that journalist wants from you. Journalists are busy, and if you can do us lazy journalists a bit of our job by providing all the information we need to write a story or a feature. So when you send me a press release, with all the main information there, some quotes, a photo of the person that gave the quotes, a load of images. If there's two equally worthy stories and one has all that and one is just some information, then I'm going to gravitate towards the one where everything's done for me. Now, I could talk for another hour on how small studios can get the attention of the press and get coverage. I don't have time, but please do come up to me afterwards, or grab my card. I've got a pocket full of them, and I'm more than prepared to talk about it again, because personally and professionally for Develop and The Observer and Guardian, I think small studios and student studios and stuff deserve just as much recognition as the big fish. So I said hassle me, there are my details. Email address, I've got a separate one for freelance, and you can hear me talk about arcade PCBs on Twitter with that one. And I'll leave them up there for a bit, and I guess it's questions time.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Well,
that's okay.
Thank you. We do have some time for a couple of questions. We'll make the time. But there is a little story I would call upon Will to recount, because whilst everybody is sort of keen to sort of get his ear, there are different people do that in different ways. And if you're the CEO of Jagex, then it might have something to do with a tank. It's an APC.
Yeah, I was about to make that correction. Anyway, I won't start talking about that. Tank's technically not the right word for any of those vehicles. I'm obviously into tanks, as I'm now revealing. The CEO of Jagex is into tanks. He let me start up one of his tanks in a crowded game development conference, causing the security to come running, and ever since I have been infatuated by the man. So, and it just, every journalist is into other things apart from writing about games all day. And again, because journalists like the sound of their own voice and their own words, most of us are on Twitter. All games journalists I know are on Twitter and fairly heavy users. That's a place you can go to gauge our interests and what makes us tick, and maybe distract us with letting us start the engine of a tank.
Right, so here's another little tip. If you want to get the kind of ears and eyes and the mind of the journalist, then having a tank is not bad.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions then from the floor? One at the back.
How do you feel about game companies who hire outside companies to handle their PR?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I guess I should make a distinction in case anyone doesn't know. Typically, game companies there's two types of PR. An agency, which might be, some agencies are actually only one or two people, but most are dozens of people. And an agency PR would represent, so I worked at an agency PR representing Sega. Typically, agencies handle the consumer national newspapers and magazines, whereas an internal PR person, someone who's employed and part of your day-to-day team and your developer, will cover specialist press, Edge, Games TM, etc., and trade press like Develop. Now, I think most press warm more to an internal PR because they see that as part of the company. But that doesn't mean there's not good agency PRs. There are a few, and if you were at the point of wanting me to recommend, it's probably not something you should do on stage, but if you wanted me to tell you who the good ones were individually, I can. But yeah, there's something about an agency. Let's say, it would be unfair of me to say names, but you've got Giant Games Company. Now, let's say you've got a fairly medium-sized games company. Someone's done well, like the Rovio guys, and then the Angry Birds lot, and then they have this enormous they don't, by the way, but just picking them as an example of the kind of studio I'm talking about. If they use this enormous agency and your point of contact is this PR agency, then it feels like, for me as a journalist contacting the agency, I'm kind of contacting people that aren't part of the culture and character of that company. And I think when you're a small studio, or a startup, or an indie studio, affording an agency is going to be tough. It doesn't necessarily mean, employing one person to do internal PR is also expensive for a young studio, but if you can find someone who just happens to have a bit of charisma on Twitter, is good with person-to-person stuff, is a more confident, characterful member of your team, they can probably handle PR, and as a journalist myself, and I think it's fair to say most journalists would warm to speaking to a guy who also is part of the development team, rather than agency PRs. Again, they can be very good, but agency PRs are slightly more this distant, abstract entity. And yeah, as an extension to that point, PR is presented as a thing you have to, PR agencies spend hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds on projects and come up with all these plans and come up with this. It makes it sound like a very large, dominating, impossible thing for a small studio to do. But in the same way that game development has been democratised and game journalism has been democratised, and there's been this rise of the smaller studio and the return to the bedroom coder, that does mean that journalists like myself are a bit more open to hearing from the small guy, the smaller studio. So yeah, PR doesn't have to be about hosting expensive press events and about sending out very polished press releases, and it can just be as simple as showing your face at events, joining in the conversation with Twitter, and making your company liked. Should we?
Yeah, that's fine. One more question.
What sort of level should you have something at before you contact a journalist? Can you submit, say, a demo of something?
I think 99% of games journalists are very much understand, that incompleted code is an incompleted code. I mean, even the biggest developers in the world, every time, maybe you've already had this experience, but it seems that every time you show some preview code to press, it breaks when the press is there in front of you. But every journalist I know is very honourable in that manner. I mean, you can do the teasing thing, maybe, just screenshots and art to attract a bit of hype, and the more clever ways you can think of it. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but if we talk later or anything, I'm sure I'll come up with some. But you can drip feed information to build anticipation, but generally that only works for studios that have already got a hit behind them or got some status behind them, because then it's, what is company X doing next? But yeah, you don't want it riddled with bugs and looking horrendous, but I think showing press early, especially if it gives me, the journalist, a bit of they've let me in, they've opened their doors to me and given me this exclusive look, then yeah, I think I wouldn't fret too much about showing stuff early. And there is, when something's off the record, when I can't account for every journalist on earth, but most journalists I know, if a developer says, please, this is off the record, keep this to yourself, journalists will, because you've got to remember, don't complicitly trust every journalist you ever deal with, but I make a living out of giving the public information about your games, and if you say, please, Will, keep this off the record, and I screw you over, you're never going to deal with me again. So journalists, it's in our interests to respect off the record. I mean, you can make me sign something that will say I'm not allowed to talk about it till this date, although in a way I think journalists slightly more warm to there being a bond of trust off the record, and there's certainly, I don't know if anybody's left in here, but there's certainly developers over the years I've built up really good trust with, so they can tell me stuff that, that I would keep off the record. But yeah, you can make journalists be quiet and they're not going to berate your game because we know that incompleted code means it's not a final experience. But, maybe the first few times you do it, baby steps at first, because, there are unscrupulous journalists around who make a living out of headlines, right? So in fact, news and features, that's probably, have I got time to waffle about this?
Not too long.
All right, I'll try and do it in 30 seconds. News is all about websites getting clicks and more readers and circulation and that kind of thing. So when delivering When working with a journalist on news, maybe a bit more careful than if I'm writing a 4-page feature about the changing role of serious gaming and you're contributing, because then it's about informing the reader for me, not about the headline. So maybe just tread a little more carefully with news.
Okay, that was excellent. Thank you very much.
Cool, cheers.